Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear me?
I can indeed, thank you.
Can I call Stephen Byers, please?
Yes.
Stand up and repeat after me. I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Mr. Byers.
Morning.
My name is Jason Beer. I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Can we thank you for the statement that you have provided us and for coming to the inquiry today to assist us with our investigation? Can you give us your full name, please?
Stephen John Byers.
In front of you, there should be a witness statement of 35 pages.
Yes.
On the 32nd page, there should be a signature. Is that your signature?
It is.
And are the contents of that witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
For the transcript, that's witness 0358000100. Can I start, please, with some questions about your background and experience? You were part, I think, of the Labour government that came into power following the general election on the 1st of May 1997.
That's correct.
You were initially a minister at the Department for Education and Employment.
Yes.
You held that role for 15 months, I think, until on the 27th of July 1998, you became Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
That's right.
You held that post for 5 months until on the 23rd of December 1998, when Peter Mandelson resigned. You took up his job as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry.
That's true.
You held that post for 2.5 years until on the 8th of June 2001 you took up a post as Secretary of State for Transport, Local Government and the Regions, which you held for just under a year when you too resigned.
That's right.
I think it follows that the two posts that you occupied, which are of most interest to the inquiry, are firstly Chief Secretary to the Treasury, July 1998 until December 1998. And then secondly, Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, December 1998 until June 2001. Dealing with the first of those posts first, can you explain in very summary terms, please, which of your responsibilities as Chief Secretary for the Treasury for that 5-month period were particularly relevant to the issues which this inquiry is examining?
Well, as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the main responsibility is public expenditure. That was the main focus of my work as Chief Secretary. And I also, as one of the sort of further responsibilities, had a sort of overview of the whole sort of PFI, PPP regime, private finance initiatives, public-private partnerships. And that obviously had an implication because the Horizon project was an example of a PFI project that we inherited from the previous administration.
And you, therefore, I think, had oversight of what you describe as the Treasury PFI task force led by Adrian Montague.
That's correct.
You say in paragraph 7 of your witness statement, if we can just turn that up, witness 03580100 at page 3. Thank you. The task force had been set up on the recommendation of a review in 1997 by Sir Malcolm Bayes, and its role was to support government departments with PFI contracts. And then moving on, given the size and scale of the project and the obviously dysfunctional relationships between the parties involved, Horizon was one of the contracts which the task force came to review. Why were there dysfunctional relationships between the parties involved?
I think the main difficulty was that the two clients, if I can put it that way, of the contract, which would be the benefits agency and post office counters, to be blunt, their interests were not aligned at all. They had two quite different objectives. For the benefits agency, it was to see benefit claimants moving on to ACT, whereas for post office counters it was a desire to ensure the future of the post office network. And those two goals were not aligned with each other. I think the other problem was that both those entities had quite different cultures, if I can put it that way. The post office was trying to be more businesslike, more entrepreneurial, more market-driven. And I think the benefits agency was very much a part of the Department of Social Security. It was a government agency, and it had its own rules and procedures that it had to follow. So they were two quite different entities trying to achieve two quite different objectives.
That doesn't necessarily lead to a dysfunctional relationship, having different objectives.
Well, it did in this case, I'm afraid.
Why did it lead to, in your view, an obviously dysfunctional relationship, having different objectives?
I think I think there may be some. The individuals concerned may have found it difficult to work with each other.
Which individuals?
I can't remember any particular individuals now.
You were, I think, going on to say something else.
And also, I think the relationship with ICL as the contractor was not a good one either. Now, whether ICL found it difficult because they were trying to service the needs of two quite different clients, I don't know. That could be an explanation.
Was it obvious to you from the very start that these differing objectives, as you put them, or described them, led to the dysfunctional relationship?
I think it made it very difficult, and I think looking back, it was a sort of fundamental flaw in the contract itself, I think.
You were secondly Secretary of State for Trade and Industry from December 98 until June 2001. Again, in very summary terms, can you please describe for the inquiry which of your responsibilities were particularly relevant to the issues which we are examining?
Well, I think for the purpose of this inquiry, there are probably two main elements of the responsibilities I had at the time. First was...
Sorry, the witness statement can come down, thank you.
First was in relation to the Post Office. The Department of Trade and Industry was the sort of sponsoring department for the Post Office.
You say in your witness statement, just pausing there, Mr. Byers, that you had overall ministerial responsibility for the Post Office.
Yes.
Is that right?
But working very much with a Minister of State who has more sort of hands-on responsibility, if I can put it that way. I mean, the relationship between the Secretary of State as a Cabinet Minister is very often as a sort of overview, whereas a Minister of State will have more sort of almost day-to-day responsibilities for a particular, very discrete area of policy. And that was the way.
I'll explore that in a moment, if we may.
Yeah. So there was the overview of the Post Office, and then also a responsibility sort of for foreign direct investment, inward investment from overseas into the UK.
Thank you. In relation to the former of those roles, overall responsibility for the Post Office, can you describe in general terms how that responsibility was exercised at this time with the Post Office being a statutory corporation?
Particularly in relation to Horizon or more?
No, generally.
Generally speaking.
Please.
Well, the role was to... the Secretary of State nominated the chair and the board members.
When you say nominated, do you mean appointed?
Appointed.
Yes.
Yes. We had responsibility for commercialisation of the Post Office, so overall direction of the Post Office. It was a monopoly, and we were looking at whether we should change that relationship, whether we should bring in more private sector involvement. So the whole sort of area of sort of demand and meeting new needs was certainly a policy area that I was responsible for as Secretary of State. And then within that, there is then the more detailed work to do, for example, with the Post Office network and the political pressures that come from that. I mean, I think at the time it was the sort of biggest retail network in the whole of Europe, very important for individual communities, but facing great challenges. So it was how we could respond to that in a positive way.
So breaking that down a little bit, if we may, did you have a junior minister with specific responsibility for the Post Office?
Yes, there was a Minister of State who had specific responsibility for the Post Office, and it was Ian McCartney, and then when Ian got moved, it was Alan Johnson.
And how were responsibilities divided between the Minister of State with responsibility for the Post Office and the Secretary of State, you, with overall responsibility for the Post Office?
I probably think, as I said a bit earlier, I think the Minister of State had almost day-to-day responsibility, so we'd be looking at things in much more detail.
Just pausing there, and apologies for interrupting you as we go along. When you say day-to-day responsibility, do you mean literally he or she may be, in this case a he, dealing with post office issues on a daily basis? Or is that a phrase intended to describe more involvement than you did, than you had?
Well, certainly more involvement than I had. I think it probably depends on the individual. It wouldn't surprise me, and I think I saw on the witness list Ian McCartney is going to give his own evidence.
Yes.
It wouldn't surprise me if Ian was involved almost on a daily basis. What I think I do mean, to be more precise, is that he would have been on top of the detail to a far greater extent than I would have been.
And how do you exercise oversight over him? Do you wait for him to come to you with issues? Do you wait for a ministerial submission, Secretary of State submission to come up to you? Or was there any other mechanism for exercising any oversight?
I'm delaying because I'm thinking back 22 years to try and sort of identify how things worked in practice. What would very often happen is that if there was an issue, for example, I'll do it in two bits if I can. If there was an element, and this is particularly relevant to the Horizon project, if there was a particular issue that, for example, Alistair Darling, as Secretary of State for Social Benefits and Social Security, was concerned about, I then, as another Secretary of State, would deal with Alistair. It was that sort of relationship. And it wouldn't often be the case that the Minister of State would have a dialogue with a Secretary of State. So that would be my involvement. So it would be something coming in from outside the department, another Secretary of State. If there's then internally, if there's a particular political issue that I would be concerned about to do with the Post Office, I would then raise it directly with the Minister of State. If there are issues that the Minister of State was dealing with in a more detailed way that he felt needed some sort of political clearance or discussion, then that would come up to me from Ian or Alan Johnson. Thank you.
You've explained that there was a Post Office board and a chairman of the Post Office.
Yes.
How, what means of communication was there between the chairman and you?
There was no formal process, so it wasn't that there was a sort of 3-monthly meeting or anything of that nature. So there would be communication by, probably in those days, by letter rather than email. I can't remember any telephone calls with the chairman, but it would be done in that rather formal way. And there'd be requests for sort of ad hoc meetings.
And they could come in either direction, from you or from him?
I can't recall myself requesting a meeting with the chairman.
As for the board, you said that, I think that as well as appointing the chairman, you appointed members of the board?
Yes, that's my recollection.
Did government have a seat on the board in any way, to your recollection?
I don't think we did, but I'm not altogether sure.
If I was to ask the general question, who was your point of contact on the Post Office board, who would you say?
It would be with the chairman.
We know that Post Office Counters Limited, POCL, was created as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Post Office in 1987. What responsibilities or oversight or governance arrangements did you have in relation to Post Office Counters Limited as Secretary of State?
I don't recall, I'm afraid.
You don't recall, you don't recall any?
No, no.
Can you recall what contact, if any, you had with that separate legal entity, Post Office Counters Limited, given in this case it was one of the contracting parties to the contract with ICL Pathway?
I wouldn't have had as Secretary of State any direct contact with POCL.
You've explained, I think, that there were no scheduled governance meetings between you as Secretary of State and the board or the chairman of the board. Is that right?
That's correct.
Would you habitually see minutes of board meetings from the post office?
No.
Do you know whether anyone in the amongst the ministerial team, in particular Mr. McCartney, did or not?
I would have thought that it would be officials, so civil servants would be receiving board minutes, and they would probably alert Ian to anything that they felt was particularly relevant. But I wouldn't see them as Secretary of State.
Was there, to your knowledge, any governance framework document in place that explained the relationships that we're now talking about?
Not to my recollection.
Thank you. You tell us in paragraph 42 of your witness statement, if we can turn that up, please. It's on page 616. It'll come up on the screen for you, Mr. Byers. Yep. At the top of the page, my overall attitude towards the project remained the same, the project being the Horizon project. But clearly my responsibility within government had changed. You're talking about here the point at which you moved from being Chief Secretary to Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. I now had to have the interests of the post office network and inward investment into the UK at the centre of my concerns. Did that remain the case throughout the duration of your time as Secretary of State up until June 2001?
Yes.
We know that at least one sub-postmistress was interviewed by Post Office investigators in March 2001 and went to a magistrate's court in November 2001, and that other investigations and prosecutions of sub-postmasters and mistresses started in 2000 and 2001. You were Secretary of State until the 8th of June 2001. Were you ever aware that prosecutions of sub-postmasters and mistresses were taking place on the basis of evidence generated by the Horizon system?
No.
Were you aware of whether there were any discussions or approval of such decisions at Post Office board level?
No, I was unaware of that.
From your knowledge of the board, are you able to comment as to whether these are matters that would have been discussed at Post Office board level?
I wouldn't know, I'm afraid.
You wouldn't know one way or the other?
No.
If the matters had been discussed at board level, is that something that the department would have been aware of through its sight of the minutes of the board meetings?
I would have thought so, yes.
And can you help us explain the relationship or the balance of power or responsibility here? What would you expect of your officials if, for example, a minute recorded or a board minute recorded, we're now prosecuting people on the basis of the Horizon system? What would you expect officials to do in relation to that?
If it was in the early stages of the Horizon project, when we essentially were still learning how it was operating in practice, then if there were a number of prosecutions and there seemed to be a sort of systematic failure in the programme, then I would have thought that ministers would have been alerted to that.
Is that the kind of relationship that departmental officials had with the post office, i.e. Exercising some sort of watching or oversight function on it?
I think the officials will be better placed to answer that than I am, I'm afraid.
Is that because you would only know if something was escalated up to you through a ministerial submission?
Yes.
And we know that that didn't happen.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I turn with that background then, please, to look at the Montague report? This is poll 302-8094. Thank you. We can see that on its face, it's dated July 1998, and we know from other evidence that it was produced or available from the 22nd of July 1998. I think that would be 5 days before you took up office as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the 27th.
That's correct, yeah.
So this report is quite fresh as you start your new job.
Yeah.
But I take it it's the kind of report that, with responsibility for the task force, as you've explained, you would have read.
Yes.
In particular, because I think that this PFI project was, I think, being badged up as the largest PFI project of its age.
That's correct.
Now, if we just take that down for a moment and go back to your witness statement, at paragraph 12, please. You say the panel, that's the three co-authors of the Montague report. Oh, sorry, it's page 5, paragraph 12.
Yep.
You say the panel, that's the three co-authors of the Montague report, made 2 recommendations for a possible way forward. 1, a full restructuring of the project, or 2, a partial restructuring. Termination of the project was ruled out, as was continuing the project as planned, or it's simply extending the contract. Now, it's certainly right that the report made 2 recommendations for a possible way forwards, a full or a partial restructuring of the project. But you say that termination of the project was ruled out. Are you saying by that sentence in the witness statement that the Montague report ruled out termination of the project?
My recollection is that was the implication of the Montague report. It may not have been expressly stated, but I think that was, I think the conclusions that one would draw from the recommendations, whether that was something that he was, a route he was not going down.
If we can just then look back at the report, please, to see whether it's expressly stated or whether it's by implication or came from another source that termination was being ruled out. Can we look at the executive summary, please, on page 3? And just before we get into this, can you help us, as a Secretary of State, to what extent would you have just read executive summaries, or would you have got into the weeds of the detail?
I honestly cannot remember on this occasion.
No, I wouldn't expect you
No,
to, but as a matter of generality.
I would expect my officials to do me a summary of the report. So I wouldn't have relied on the report itself. My officials would have given me advice based on the report. I'd have received this as Chief Secretary, not Secretary of State. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Looking at the executive summary then, we can ignore the first 3 bullet points because they're background. And if we scroll down to findings then, please. If you just scan through those, I think you will have read these more recently because
yes,
the document's been provided. And then go over the page, please. to possible way forwards. If you just scan through those. So the second bullet point is essentially the full restructuring. The third bullet point is the partial restructuring that you spoke about in paragraph 12. You can see here, and I don't think there's anything in the detail of the report that is different to this, that the authors do not address the issue of terminating the project, less still do they themselves rule out that option. Are you, do you say, therefore, that because they were talking about a full or partial restructuring of the project, you took it that by implication they had ruled out termination? Or do you think the option of termination and ruling it out came from elsewhere, thinking back?
I think any reasonable person would conclude from the findings and the possible way forward that cancellation or termination had effectively been ruled out by the Montague report.
Because they were only speaking about partial or full restructuring.
And they don't even address the issue of termination or cancellation.
And you take that to mean, or took that to mean, a ruling out by them?
By the Montague report. But I hadn't ruled it out in my own mind as Chief Secretary.
And why hadn't you ruled it out in your own mind?
So I came in on the 28th of July.
Yes.
And there were certainly a couple of occasions as things developed, and I could see basically the mess that the Horizon project was in, that we would have to consider the possibility of cancellation. And that was a live consideration during my time.
Was it always a live consideration when you were both Chief Secretary and Secretary of State?
I think when I became Secretary of State, well, two things. I think by the time I left the Treasury in December, having reviewed the option of cancellation, I'd come round to the view that actually that was not going to be possible.
Was there any direction from number 10 that termination as an option should be ruled out, that this project was going to go ahead?
Not that I can recall.
Can we look then at the report in some more detail and go to page 6, please? And look at the terms of reference. Again, there's some background in paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 tells us that the panel was set up and chaired by the head of the Treasury Task Force. That's Adrian Montague. To your knowledge, did Adrian Montague have any technical expertise himself?
No, I don't think he did.
And then the other two members, if we just go back to the first page of the report, that they're listed, if we scroll down, thank you. Bill Robbins, he was head of the Northern Ireland Social Security Agency. Do you remember that?
I honestly don't know.
Okay. And so you wouldn't be able to help us whether he had any technical expertise or knowledge in IT himself?
The panel was appointed before I became Chief Secretary. So.
And Alec Wiley was Director General of Communications and Information Services in the Ministry of Defence. Again, you wouldn't be able to help us, I suspect, given your previous answers, with whether he had any technical expertise in IT projects.
I'm sorry, I just don't know.
Okay, can we go back to page 6 then, please, at paragraph 3. essentially the terms of reference, we, the panel, were asked to assess whether the project can deliver a fully functioning system which meets the project specification and integrates fully with BA and POCL computer systems, whether the timetable for completing the system's development and starting and completing rollout is deliverable, and whether the necessary managerial and organisational structures are in place, the likely cost of delivery under current contract dates and with extension, and in each of these areas, the risks associated with these assessments and whether robust monitoring arrangements and disciplines are in at place. So that's the terms of reference. And it's the first one that I'm particularly interested in, whether the project can deliver a fully functioning system which meets the project specification and integrates with the existing systems. Can we go back, please, to page 3, the executive summary and the findings. And the second bullet point, I think, addresses this. Our view is that the programme is technically viable. There must be some risk around scalability and robustness because the system has had to be tested at the level of component parts, but we're satisfied these risks are being well managed by Pathway. Just looking at that at the moment, do you understand that to be the answer to the question in the terms of reference as to whether the project can deliver a fully functioning system?
Yes, I think so.
And what do you understand? What did you understand that to mean? Our view is that the programme is technically viable.
I think we knew it was a very challenging programme and in some respects breaking new ground. And I think we would need to be assured that actually it could be delivered in practice.
Would you agree that in the way that the issue is approached, it means feasible, the project is feasible, i.e. that the system proposed can, from a technological point of view, be feasibly delivered and built?
Yes, and I think combined with the point made in bullet 3 about future-proofing, yes, that would be my conclusion.
I'm going to come to bullet 3 in a moment.
Apologies.
That's all right. The reason for exploring this, I should say in advance, is that in a number of places you rely on the phrase, we were told by Montague that the project is technically viable.
Yes.
And subsequently that phrase is used within government a lot as meaning, or it might be taken to mean something rather different, i.e. the project, the system, is in fact robust and has integrity, which is why I'm exploring.
I'm with you. Yeah, I get it.
Would you agree that that doesn't mean that the Montague report, that paragraph, does not mean, or you didn't take it to mean, that the system was, as it stood, necessarily robust and had integrity?
It wasn't a sort of blank check going forward. I'd accept that.
Can we just look at the body of the report to see if that helps us any further? Page 11, please. And at the foot of the page, under Solution, Design and Fitness for Purpose, paragraph 24, we believe the programme can deliver the contracted functionality. The technical architecture is necessarily highly complex. Systems must be separated for contractual reasons. They, over the page, have to have high levels of resilience and security, and they employ a number of different computing platforms. These factors have been well considered in the design and structuring of the project and technical architecture. And then 25, the main architectural issues are scalability and robustness. We're advised that a solution of this scale and scope with so many different platforms and problems has, as far as PA, that was a consulting agency, is aware, no precedent. We're satisfied that Pathway's approach to design development and performance testing is sufficiently rigorous for such a major undertaking. At this stage of development, testing has to be based on the component parts rather than the entire system. We believe this has been completed in an appropriately structured way. Indeed, it is a strength of the modular nature of the architecture that this approach has been taken. Significant attention is being given to testing at the correspondent server level, where the highest risk of congestion occurs. So did you understand at this point that there had been no end-to-end testing of the system? It was only of the component parts?
I don't think that level of detail was drawn to my attention.
I understand. Then if we look at 26, given the size of the system, there's an unavoidable risk that it cannot have all been tested end-to-end in earnest. However, we're satisfied that Pathway has contingency plans to upgrade individual components of the architecture should that prove necessary. We therefore assess the risk of the entire solution failing to operate as expected to be as low as could be achieved in the circumstances. What did you understand that last point to mean in the last sentence there? What guarantee or what conclusion was being drawn?
I think the conclusion I would draw is that we'd have to test it in real life practical situations.
The risk being addressed in that sentence, would you agree, is the entire thing failing?
Yes.
Rather than an assessment of whether the system is robust and has integrity.
No, I'll accept that, but also it does refer to Pathway having contingency plans to upgrade those individual components.
The reason for asking you this is if we look, please, at your witness statement, and if we look at page 12 of your witness statement. And then at the foot of the page, a question in italics that the inquiry asked: to what extent were the interdepartmental discussions about the future of the Horizon project influenced by, at this stage, by a number of things? And then the third point is issues concerning the technical integrity and robustness of Horizon. And then if we go over the page, please. In 33, you say the financial consequences of any decision were a crucial consideration. Cancelling the project would have meant writing off hundreds of millions of pounds of public and private investment in a project which, and then you say this, as we had been advised by the Montague report, was technically viable. The question you were being asked was about issues concerning the technical integrity and robustness of the system, and you answer the question about integrity and robustness by reference to the Montague report's conclusion on technical viability. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, yes.
In your mind, were they the same things or different? Or didn't you address them?
I certainly didn't address them at the time I was Chief Secretary.
Thank you. And then a little further down at 35. When you're addressing that third point, Roman 3 of the inquiry's question, you say, as for the technical integrity and robustness of Horizon, the Montague report in July 98 had assured us that the project was technically viable and showed good evidence of future-proofing. That future-proofing is the third bullet point we're going to come back
yes.
to in a moment. Again, that tends to suggest, and you've written this in a way that was referring to your state of knowledge back in 1998, that you equated the technical integrity and robustness of the system with what Montague had said about its technical viability. Do you see?
Yes, I understand that point.
in your mind, were they one and the same thing?
Yes, I think I probably did take that view.
Sir Adrian Montague, as he now is, has made a witness statement to the inquiry saying about his review that it was not possible to test Horizon for real. The review focused on whether at a high level the project could be delivered successfully, rather than whether it was operating or indeed could operate in accordance with its contractual specification. Of course, this meant that none of the shortcomings in the Horizon system in operation that came to dog the project in later years was or could have been evident at this stage. Thinking back, did you understand that what the Montague report was about was not against the background of having tested the Horizon system in operation? It was all about whether the project could, in theory, be technically deliverable successfully.
Yes, and I think that's why we insisted as ministers that there had to be live trials of Horizon. It had to be tested in a real working environment. And that's not, Adrian couldn't address that at the time of his report.
Can we go back to the Montague report, please? Which was, thank you. And then if we can look at page 3. And go back to the bullet point that we were about to turn to under findings, third bullet point. So we're looking at the paragraph underneath the one we were previously looking at. There is good evidence of future-proofing at all levels. The basic infrastructure is very robust for the future, and in the main, industry standard products have been used. The system should allow POCL to compete for new business in a variety of markets. New applications based on smart card technology should be relatively straightforward and economic. If online applications are required, they may take longer and require more investment. Did you take anything from that conclusion as to the existing robustness of the system, or whether this is instead looking at the future?
I think here his finding is looking to the future.
To what extent can you now recall whether there was reliance within government on what had been said by Montague generally as to the technical viability of the product or the system as meaning that it was a robust system?
I think we did take that from the Montague report. It would be helpful, and I have to admit I haven't seen it, the work that PA Consulting did, because I think they would have been the entity that would have addressed the sort of detailed technical issues around how robust Horizon actually was at this stage.
Can you recall what had led to, I'll put that in another way, can you recall how Montague went about his work, i.e. what level of deep dive into the operation of the system he undertook?
I think Sir Adrian's going to be in a better position to address that.
Would you agree that it is logical that the report could not offer a view on the existing integrity or robustness of the system because it had not been built yet?
That would be a sensible conclusion.
You tell us in your witness statement, if we can go back to that, please, at paragraph 19. That's on page 7. that, I think despite their differences, all of the government departments were agreed that it was essential that Horizon undergo a live testing programme rather than acceptance on the basis of laboratory testing, as ICL were pushing for. That's something that you've mentioned this morning. The DSS the DSS in particular had a bad experience with an IT project which had been accepted in a test environment and which had failed when actually rolled out. And you say that was a priority concern for them. Can you recall who the supplier was there? And whether it was in fact ICL?
I can't recall, I'm afraid.
Can you recall, or do you remember the DSS being in litigation with ICL at this time?
I can't recall that.
One thing we don't see in the Montague report is a reference back to any of the issues that had been raised or concerns raised about the pathway proposals in the course of the procurement exercise. To what extent, as a member of the new government, did you have sight of issues and concerns raised about the technical viability of the pathway proposal?
I think it's one of the great frustrations we had as ministers in the new administration that we were not provided with any detailed information about the difficulties that may have been experienced with pathway during the tendering process. That was all denied to us, and there is a well-established protocol that members of the new government administration cannot see the documents or the policy papers that were provided to the previous administration. So we were blindsided, and I can understand why, for political reasons, one is not allowed to sort of delve into why particular political decisions were taken. But I cannot see why, if technical weaknesses and problems had been identified under a previous administration, why we couldn't have been alerted to those, and we were not.
That's a convention of our administration of politics.
Yeah, well, of government, not just
of government.
Yeah.
What is your understanding of the limit of it, or the limits of it? What are you denied access to?
Well, on this occasion, everything. I mean, we had four key questions as ministers that we wanted answered about this dysfunctional, fatally flawed contract that was Horizon. We wanted to know who decided it should be a benefit payment card and not a smart card. Why did they arrive at the decision it should be a PFI contract when in fact this was a fantastically complicated contract? Was PFI the right approach? We didn't have the details of the tendering process, but I think the inquiry may have sort of delved into that. And finally, why did they end up with basically two clients in the Benefits Agency and POCL whose interests were not aligned? Now, we were denied any of that information as the new administration. As I said earlier, I can understand why we can't delve into the political decisions, the party political decisions, if you like. I can understand why we were not shown the sort of details the inquiries now had about our decision-making process during this period. But I would have thought that if flaws in the system had been identified at an early stage, there's no reason why that couldn't be disclosed to an incoming administration. It would have helped us enormously if, as ministers, we'd been told that these problems had been identified.
And so just testing that at a more general level, are you denied all previous papers of the past administration?
Yes.
And what does all previous papers mean?
from my recollection, when we would inquire from our civil servants, who would have been part of that process, what happened, what was the reasoning behind it, there was a veil that we couldn't lift.
One, to use this as a case study, could understand why you wouldn't be able to see submissions to ministers. Agreed?
Yes, no, I understand that. Yes, I would understand that.
One could understand why you couldn't see inter-ministerial or inter-Secretary of State correspondence.
Yes, I mean, to be honest, much of the information that's before the inquiry around our decision-making process as ministers, I wouldn't expect to see that.
No. If you were the next administration after
no.
yours, no. Yeah. But if technical reports had been prepared, is there anything, to your understanding, in the convention that would have prevented them from being seen by Adrian Montague?
It would be interesting to know if Adrian had that information. I don't know the answer to that.
The question was slightly different. Is there anything, to your knowledge, in the convention that would prevent, or would have prevented him from seeing that previous technical assessment of the Horizon proposal by ICL Pathway?
It's such a long time ago, I honestly can't recall the detail of the convention now.
And Mr. Byers, who would be the arbiter of the convention, assuming, forget Horizon, assuming that you as an incoming Chief Secretary were really anxious to see a particular document which you knew must have existed, for example. Who would actually say you are denied, so to speak?
Well, it would probably. I'm trying to recall, Chair, if it happened in my time. It would be first of all a request to your own private office, so your principal private secretary, and if he or she said, "I'm really sorry, we can't disclose that information," and if I felt very strongly about it, I would then go to the permanent secretary, the head of the department, and they would rule one way or the other.
Right. Thank you very much.
And can you recall that issue arising in relation to Horizon about technical issues, or was it limited to the four more political issues that you had mentioned a moment ago?
I can't remember any specific request around the technical questions.
Because the inquiry, you may know, has received a vast body of evidence concerning issues and concerns raised over the ICL pathway proposals in the course of the tendering process, each stage of the procurement exercise. And that knowledge gained doesn't appear to have featured in any of your decision making or indeed in Adrian Montague's report.
Or was drawn to our attention. I mean, there's no documents that refer to those discoveries.
No. Can we move on then, please, and go back to the Montague report and look at page 4, please? That's poll 3028094. We can see from the last bullet point that one of the recommendations was the appointment of a neutral troubleshooter directly responsible to ministers and with their full confidence to ensure all the parties give their full commitment to implementation of the programme and that rollout is completed at the earliest agreed date. Was that recommendation, the appointment of a neutral troubleshooter, accepted by you?
Yes, it was.
I just want to see what happened after the report was delivered. Can we look at HMT 400055? if we just see this as a letter dated the 10th of September 1998, and if we go to the last page, please, page 3. And scroll down. We can see that from page 1 it was addressed to Alistair Darling. He was then the Secretary of State for the DSS, and copied to the Prime Minister. Jack Cunningham, I think he was then the Minister for the Cabinet Office and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
That's right, yeah.
Peter Mandelson, who was then the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. That was the job that you were soon to be taking up but didn't know it yet.
Yeah.
Ian McCartney, I think his formal title was Minister of State for Competitiveness. Does that ring a bell?
It does, but within that overall brief, he had specific responsibility for the Post Office.
And Sir Richard Wilson, who I think was the Cabinet Secretary and the head of the Civil Service.
He was.
At that time. Okay, if we go back to page 1, please. It's clear from paragraph 1 that you've met with 3 others the previous day. You say 3 streams of work, and you say first, in paragraph 3, there must be a negotiation between the parties to the contract. You would propose to write to ICL in the terms at Annex A to set the framework. Can we just look at that, please? That's pages 4 and 5 of the document. So this is a draft letter from you to ICL Pathway. We'll see in due course that it was sent in these terms. As you know, ministers have been reviewing the future of the project in view of the serious delays to the implementation timetable and ICL Pathway's failure to deliver a key contractual milestone for which ICL Pathway has been placed in breach of contract. We remain seriously concerned by the slow rate of progress on this project, which was originally scheduled to be fully operational by October 1998. And of course, that's the date at which you're writing this, or the month before.
Yeah.
However, we've decided to allow a period of 1 month for discussion between the parties to see whether satisfactory commercial terms can be agreed for continuing the project. Outstanding differences on the timetable can be resolved and a credible programme for full implementation can be agreed. To facilitate the process, I am proposing to appoint an advisor to work with the parties towards finding a solution. He'll report directly to me, and I expect him to be given full cooperation by all the parties. His terms of reference are attached. To provide a satisfactory outcome, the conclusion of the discussions must meet a number of basic criteria, which include: 1, any adjustment to the contracts must, of course, be compatible with procurement law. 2, the contract must provide a firm date after which the benefits agency will have no further commitment to using the benefit payment card. A general point is made to avoid misunderstanding. ICL Pathway entered into these contracts on PFI terms, which entail accepting significant risks. It should be clear at the outset, therefore, that the discussions are not posited on an outcome which would ensure that Pathway, a positive return on the project. Can you just decode what you mean there? I think I know what you mean.
It was a general principle under PFI that risk transfer to the private sector, and therefore if there was a loss to be made by ICL, that was a risk that they'd taken by agreeing to the PFI contract.
So this was a condition to entering into the process that you were proposing?
Yes, and I think there may have been an indication, this is a presumption, so I'm sorry, but I think there may have been an indication from ICL Pathway before that if they were not going to get a positive return, then they would have difficulty proceeding.
You outlined some other conditions. Agreement that no party will issue legal proceedings against any other while the discussions are being conducted. Discussions will be conducted in the strictest confidence and without prejudice. Work on the project will continue in accordance with the existing contracts while discussions are continuing. and you ask them whether they're prepared to accept. Can we go back to page 2 of the letter, please? And paragraph 4, you say we will need, this is to your colleagues in government, we will need to appoint a troubleshooter to facilitate the process. You annex at B, proposed terms of reference. You're considering who might be a suitable appointment for this important position. Was Graham Corbett in due course appointed as that neutral troubleshooter to that important position?
Yes, he was.
And was he chosen by you?
On the recommendation of, I think, Steve Robson, who was second permanent secretary in the Treasury.
In your statement, you say it was, the cross-reference is paragraph 22 to your statement, that it was on the recommendation of Adrian Montague.
You could be right. That must be the case.
It's more important for you to be right.
Yes, no, of course. I apologise.
No, that's all right. Do you want to just look at what you said in your statement?
Please do.
So it's paragraph 22 of your statement.
Because I'm thinking about it now, I'm sure that Steve Robson had some role, but I could be wrong. And I'm sure in preparing my witness statement, I'd have double-checked on whose recommendation.
You're quite right. You do say, and another HMT official, Steve Robson. So it's both.
That would be it.
And why was he chosen?
He had... His expertise was... He was very much a sort of a finance man, and
so the statement can come down. Thank you.
Yeah, and he also he was a pretty robust character, and I think we'd got to the stage where we probably needed heads knocked together, and I think the view was that he would be a good person to do that.
Yes, that can come down as well, thank you. There's some reference to that in the papers, that heads needed to be knocked together. Was it the robustness of his personality that led you to believe?
I think he had a reputation for in a very appropriate way of being, not in a bullying or intimidating way, but a way of being sort of assertive and pointing out to people that they had responsibilities and they should be doing the right thing. And I think that applied, and I think this was covered in that note, because I'm saying to people like Peter Mandelson and Alistair Darling that they had responsibilities to make sure that their respective teams were entering into this process in a positive way.
See, it wasn't a just ICL pathway that needed to have its head knocked.
No, there were quite a few heads that needed to be knocked.
Can we go back to HMT 6055, please? And turn to page 6, please. Which are the terms of reference for the troubleshooter? Skipping the first paragraph, the advisor will report to ministers via the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, you. And was that deliberate, that it was to your level rather than to the ministers under you, such as Mr. McCartney?
Well, at this stage, I was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so
I'm so sorry.
I was under Gordon Brown would be the way it would work, but Gordon wasn't involved in this. He was later. I was in the middle of, I think I described in my witness statement a bit like a spider's web. So I was trying to get government departments, trade and industry, social security, so Peter Mandelson and Alistair Darling, to work together and to agree to this process. And so I was trying to be the sort of matchmaker in this whole thing. And that's a role, actually, the Chief Secretary often plays, because having responsibility for public spending, your cabinet colleagues are always very keen to be sort of quite friendly with you, because you decide if they're going to get money or not. So you have a sort of a role to play, and when there's a particular problem which we had here involving separate government departments, then, and I think this is still the case today, the Chief Secretary is often the person who actually brokers deals between departments. And
that's why you're the web and each of those men are spiders.
Yeah, well, I was reflecting yesterday evening on whether that was actually not a very appropriate description, but it's, hopefully the inquiry gets my meaning.
Yes, I think, yeah. Well, at least I do. You'll see the objectives set out. The immediate objective will be to report to ministers within 1 month on whether there is a commercial basis for proceeding with the project which is acceptable to the parties, whether there is in place a satisfactory implementation plan with a detailed timetable for completing the project, and any further action which would need to be taken to ensure successful delivery of the project, and then scrolling down. The role of the advisor will be to convene and chair discussions between the parties, commission papers and proposals from the parties, and then over the page. Independently appraise parties' claims and contributions, produce compromise proposals, take such other action as he sees fit to establish an acceptable basis for continuation, ensure the parties provide information necessary for the analysis of alternative options. The advisor will have no power to bind the parties. And then lastly this, if the project continues, there's likely to be a continuing role for the advisor in facilitating process. So that last paragraph made it clear that there ought to be a continuing role for the troubleshooter, is that right?
Yes.
Now I think you secured some broad consensus for these proposals.
Yes.
If we look at what was said, HMT 6052. Just counting my zeros. Yes, brilliant. Thank you. This is a letter from Alistair Darling at the DSS to you. 14th of September, thanking you for your letter of the 10th. And scroll down, please. He's grateful to you for the more detailed account you've now provided of the proposed way forwards. It's important for there to be a rigorous process, at the end of which it will be clear that the route forward produced better value for money for government. And on this basis, I agree with what is proposed. I particularly support what you say about the need to provide sufficient analysis of the three main options to allow us to judge at the conclusion of the discussions with Pathway whether the outcome of the negotiations offers us best value for money for the public sector as a whole. There's one specific point from that he would like to see included in the letter to ICL, that the department's ability to migrate to an ACT-based system in preparation for the end of card usage by contract end date should be apparent to ICL. We're working on a strategy, and then continue, please. More generally, there are some important points we need to establish before we take forward discussions with ICL. The government's view of the strength of its negotiating position with ICL. If you just read that to yourself, what he said.
Okay.
Second bullet point, discussion of any option to continue is clearly presented at all times against the backdrop of government's right to terminate. That's self-explanatory. And agreement on the legal and financial parameters of the negotiations. In particular, the contract cannot safely be carried on beyond 2007 and prices cannot be significantly increased. And then the last paragraph on that page, he welcomes your assurance at the meeting that Treasury would be prepared to provide the additional requirement if it fell to my budget. I think that's an example of the kind of thing you were just mentioning. Mm. So decoding what Alistair Darling is saying there, would you agree this is a cautious but conditional yes?
It's a very Alistair Darling letter, which is...
We don't know what that means.
Just as you've expressed it. It's cautious, but a lukewarm yes. He's doing what a good Secretary of State does. He's laying down clear sort of conditions and parameters for the discussion, and some red lines as well, I think, and he's looking after the interests of his department.
One of the things I'm going to come back to when we look at all this correspondence as a whole run is whether that's what people were doing, looking after the interests of their department, and sight was lost of the sub-postmasters in the process. You understand?
I do.
Can we look at the reply from Peter Mandelson, then Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, at HMT 6048? And I think we're going to find, but I'd like you to confirm that this reply is a more fulsome yes. Thank you for your letter of the 10th of September. Scrolling down, I confirm my contempt with what you proposed. In particular, I accept the remit set out in paragraph 5 of your letter. My objective, within the initial timescale of 1 month, will be as a minimum to agree with the Post Office Board the actions that need to be taken on each of the items listed to ensure that practical measures are put in place as quickly as possible to take these actions forward, to institute arrangements to monitor progress on a regular basis, and to be in a position to report back to colleagues such substantive progress as may have been possible on each by the end of the first month. He is pleased to see that you envisage a role for the troubleshooter which extends beyond the initial negotiation. This is reflected in the draft terms of reference. That was that last paragraph of the annex that we read.
Yeah.
This will be important in minimising the misunderstandings and disagreements between the parties, which have undoubtedly contributed to delays in the past. And then over the page, finally, he agrees with the suggestion, I didn't in fact read this in your proposal, of an interdepartmental working group, including the policy unit. Again, could you decode or translate how you read his letter as a whole?
Yes,
Have I characterised it as a more fulsome yes?
I think it's a positive agreement to the work of a troubleshooter. Yeah.
And then the third party in this, ICL Pathway, replying to that letter that you saw in draft. Yeah. I'm not going to go to the version in fact sent. That's Bayes 50283. Thank you. Letter to you from, if you just scroll down on the right-hand side, please. Scroll down, from Keith Todd. Can you see that, Chief Executive?
Yes, yes.
Then just going back up, please. He thanks you for your letter of the 15th of September. We reject the allegation that ICL Pathway is in breach of contract. You'll be aware we've already taken serious exception to the attempts by the DSS to establish this position in their correspondence to us. We continue to believe that this programme offers major long-term benefits to both the Benefits Agency and the Post Office, as well as wider government aspects. Therefore, keen to see this project continue and are prepared, without prejudice to our legal rights, to agree to the 1 month period of discussion for the purpose and on the terms which you suggest. He's satisfied with the terms of reference for the independent advisor and will give him our full cooperation. Regarding the conditions for opening discussion mentioned in paragraph 6, we confirm we'll accept them for the relevant period of 1 month. And then scrolling down, we make the point that paragraphs 4 and 5 of your letter cause some concern. Any adjustments to the contract must be compatible with procurement law. We've already sent to the parties and the Treasury our legal opinion that a commercial settlement of our differences will cause no difficulty. As far as other matters are concerned, in our view, it's not helpful to the process of full and frank discussion and negotiation to set any preconditions to the components of a commercial settlement. These are matters that have to be discussed as part of the negotiations in order to reach a settlement. So those conditions, remember there were 4 of them that you were setting out, he's saying no, they need to be part of the discussion rather than preconditions for entering into a discussion. And then continuing, he asks for details of the independent advisor. So characterising that as a whole, would you say relatively frosty but willing to engage in the process?
Yes, and I think and trying to protect their position as a company.
So although we're part way through this run of correspondence, 11:15 now, that might be an appropriate moment to take a break until 11:30.
Yes, Mr. Beer, but I'm while it's fresh in my mind, I would just like to ask Mr. Byers 1 or 2 other questions about this convention, which is the first time that I've heard it in this inquiry, at least, Mr. Byers. Right. All right. So can I ask some basic questions? Is this a convention, i.e. that you don't get information about what the previous government has been up to, which operates only if there's a change of government, which includes a change of government of political persuasion?
I'd always assumed so. And given what's happened over recent months, it would be a bit chaotic if the 4th Chancellor in 9 months can't be told what the previous... Yes,
that's what I would have expected, but I just wanted to be clear about that. But there must be a number of instances, Horizon being one of them, where a project begins under one government, but is obviously intended, or at least might continue, under another.
Yes.
And on the face of it, trying to be objective, I would have thought that knowing what went on about technical aspects relating to a project like Horizon, before you become the government, might assist in helping you to make decisions after you've become the government.
The officials in the department will have had that information, so they will be aware of it.
Yeah.
They clearly feel constrained to let the new administration know. Now, I can understand, as I was saying to Mr. Beer, I can understand if it's a sort of party political issue, why we wouldn't be told. I think everybody would go along with that. I think if there are technical problems which have been identified within a project like Horizon, then I don't see why we couldn't be told or alerted to the fact that there may be weaknesses, because then we would have constructed something in a way which would have addressed them.
Right. But as a matter of fact, in this instance, you weren't told, I think is your evidence, yeah?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Now, in this particular instance, there's a variation that I wanted you to consider, and that is that one of the parties to the contract, which was concluded in 1996, was the statutory corporation, namely the Post Office. So what would be preventing, and I'm not saying this in any critical sense, I'm just trying to understand it, what would prevent an incoming relevant minister from simply asking the Post Office what went on?
That's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
All right. Because as you'll understand, I have to try and make sense of governance issues. So
good luck with that one, yes.
Yeah. Because on the face of it, the best people to provide information about, say, the procurement or evaluation process are the evaluators, and they were the Post Office and other civil servants. Yeah.
Yes, and they would be the same people. I mean, they didn't change, and I think you'll hear evidence from the relevant civil servant who was in charge of the post office for a number of years, under successive administrations. But in this case, I can't see anywhere, and I can't remember, and I haven't seen anything in the documents that have been provided to the inquiry to show that as ministers, or certainly myself as Secretary of State, was alerted to the problems that were identified in the tendering process, which has been referred to by counsel to the tribunal.
All right, thank you. It becomes more and more intriguing, this aspect. Thanks very much. Let's have our break. Should we now break until 25 to or what?
Yes, thank you very much, sir.
Right, thanks.
Good morning again, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can, thank you.
So just to explain to you, we are in possession in the inquiry of the ministerial code, the cabinet manual from the time that we're talking about, and the Directory of Civil Service guidance, which sits underneath the cabinet manual, each of which contain, to a greater or lesser extent, guidance on the parameters of the code, the convention that we have been discussing. But given Mr. Byers' answers earlier about, given the length of time that has elapsed since he held relevant office, I haven't thought it appropriate to use Mr. Byers as a witness to explore any further the convention, and instead are going to leave his answers where they stand.
Well, I'm perfectly happy with that, Mr. Beer, because as usual, you appear to be ahead of me. But I was just interested in what Mr. Byers was saying.
Thank you very much, sir. Can we look, please, at poll 302-8098? And go to page 3, please. So we've been looking before the break, Mr. Byers, at the outfall from the Montague report, one of which recommendations was the appointment of the neutral troubleshooter, the appointment of Graham Corbett and his terms of reference. And this is the product of the appointment of Graham Corbett in the role that we have seen. It's a letter to you dated the 18th of October 1998. In the first paragraph, he records that he was appointed by you on the 17th of September and was required to report by the 16th of October 1998. So within a month. Can we go to page 4, please, over the page? Now, I think you've seen this document as part of your preparation for giving evidence today. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it paragraph by paragraph, but if we just look at the heading there, the discussions which I held with the parties and the information developed for these discussions were all without prejudice and confidential. That was one of the conditions, I think, that was set. And then under the heading, the path of the discussions, commercial. And he sets out over the rest of that page, if we just scan through it and scroll down, and then on to the next page, essentially a chronological account of the attempts that he had made to negotiate between the three parties, BA on the one hand, Post Office on the other, and ICL on the third. And then over the page again, please. And he concludes there was no further change in the position between the parties when the without prejudice discussion month came to an end at midday on the 16th of October. And then he turns to the path of discussions, programme and project management issues, narrating that a working group was established of the programme directors from each of the parties under the chairmanship of the director of the Horizon Programme Office, and with PA Consulting keeping close to and guiding their discussions. He annexes PA Consulting's report. And then if we scroll on, please. There's a narration of the parties' views in the first two main paragraphs on that page. So far we've had discussion about seeking to resolve at a commercial and essentially contractual level the dispute between the parties. It's right, I think, that there's nothing to do with issues of technical reassurance or the integrity or reliability of the system that might be produced as part of this exercise. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Would that be consistent with Mr. Corbett's appointment, that he was brought to knock commercial heads together rather than knock technical heads together?
That's an accurate reflection of the role we expected Corbett to take, yeah.
And then scroll down, please, to the way forward. If you just read that first paragraph to yourself, please. And then over the page, please. He's profoundly disappointed that we've been able to reach our primary objective, and will continue to hope that some way of bringing this project to fruition may yet be found. In the meantime, progress made or programme issues will be of real and enduring benefit if the project continues. And then he pays tribute to the hard work that others involved in the project have given.
Mr. Beer, could we possibly go back to the end of the preceding page?
Yes, of course. And then,
yeah,
that's it. To the running saws list.
No, it's the bottom bit. I'd also urge that as soon as BA can be satisfied, that it has a. Because I think that's referring to the ability.
I would also urge that as soon as BA can be satisfied that it has a, and then over the page.
Yeah.
System which works both on test and in practice.
Yeah.
Consideration should be given to reshaping the contracts so as to take BA out of the contractual loop and position them as a POCL client.
Yeah.
What was the significance of that you wish to draw to our attention?
I think I mentioned earlier that one of the big problems we had was effectively having two clients, BA and POCL. And this is the first sort of indication that we should be looking at a much more streamlined approach where there is only really one client, which is POCL, and that we take BA out of the equation. And this is saying that provided BA have a system which they're satisfied with, that works both in test and in practice, then we could remove them from the sort of contractual arrangement and just have one client, which would be POCL. So we're trying to remedy some of the major deficiencies in the contract that we inherited from the previous administration.
What was your view overall of the outcome of the Corbett attempt?
To be honest, I didn't make as much progress as we would have wanted. The parties were still not working together. I think Graham himself, I'm trying to recall, I think he said to me that he wasn't sure there was a continuing role for him to play.
That's what I was about to ask you. That document
sorry.
can come down now. What continuing role did Mr. Corbett, in fact, play as envisaged by the terms of reference of his appointment?
To the best of my recollection, I think Graham told me that he'd got as far as he could with the parties. That's my recollection.
And is it right that he didn't have any further role contrary to what had been envisaged by the terms of reference.
That's correct. That's correct.
Why did he think he got no further role to play?
I think he got as far as he could with the parties, and he couldn't see that his continued involvement would add value to what we're trying to achieve.
The terms of reference thought that there should be a continuing role for the independent troubleshooter in the event that the project proceeded.
Yeah.
Was that role taken up by him or anyone else when the project did proceed?
No.
And do you remember why that was? An honest broker.
Yeah, I think the view was that sort of troubleshooter role, we tried it and it hadn't really been that effective.
Thank you. Can we turn to December 1998, please, and look at CBO 0010 0001. Thank you. And if we can just enlarge that to make it a bit clearer. Yes, sorry, I should have said at 76. Thank you. That's better, thank you. And again, enlarge it, please, thank you. This is a letter from Keith Todd. If we just scroll down on the right again, we can see that. Back up, please, to you of the 9th of December. So a letter from the Chief Executive of ICL to you. I'm not going to take you to your letter of the 20th. You had written to the parties and set a deadline to arrive at heads of agreement, and you were looking to ICL to make what was described as a speedy and decisive move. Do you remember that?
Yes, I think the letter of the 20th followed on from the Corbett proposals or recommendations.
And was that a different way of attempting to break the deadlock?
I think so.
It's been suggested in some of the evidence that the inquiry has received that it was government that was responsible for the deadlock here, and that 1998 was essentially a lost year because of the internecine squabbling between two departments of state, DSS and DTI. Does that reflect your recollection?
There were clear disagreements between those two entities. Whether I would describe it in quite the way that you have, I'm not sure I would, but there were clearly disagreements, yes. And this goes back to the point about having two clients to the contract with quite different objectives and different cultures.
If you can just scan through the letter.
I should also add, by the way, that it's not helped by the fact that ICL were over budget and way behind schedule.
They have suggested in turn that was because of the delay, and that delay itself in making a decision was causing them to lose millions on a monthly basis.
I think ICL had a lot of responsibility.
They say ICL in the end of the second paragraph, in the interest of resolving the impasse, I'm prepared to make a speedy and decisive move. A major criticism of ICL's proposals appear to have been that ICL sought, I should just stop there, I haven't in the interest of time taken you to the immediate November exchanges that immediately post-dated the Corbett.
Yeah, I get that.
To transfer risk back to the public sector. The impression was also created that Fujitsu was in the process of withdrawing its support from the Pathway project. There was also a view that the ICL proposals in the commercial and contractual paper represented unacceptable price increases. And then they say they're going to address these points. He says that he's discussed this with Fujitsu, and the chairman of the ICL PLC board both support my proposal. It's our best offer. I've no hope of persuading my shareholder or board to give me further room to move. First, Fujitsu is prepared to fund the whole project. This represents an investment of £600 million. Of what significance was that?
I can't recall.
Okay. Scrolling down, please. We revised and restructured our commercial proposals with the last iteration of the corporate proposals in the second column, and then ICL's proposal in the third. And then so that's the amount that the public sector would contribute. You'll see that there's 90-odd million pounds difference between them in the totals at the foot of the page.
Yeah.
And then over the page, please. ICL, after the footnotes, after the bullet points, ICL is also prepared to accept an even higher degree of risk. Under ICL's MPV, losses increased to £180 million. And then scroll down, please. The other main features of our offer is as follows. He then sets them out. This offer represents an enormous commitment for ICL, and one can only be justified if we have confidence in the contractual arrangements and the commitment of ministers moving forwards. And just stopping there, the impression that's given by this slew of correspondence is that this has been taken out of the POCL board's hands. Is that right? This is direct communication between, negotiation between a contractor and a Secretary of State.
Yes, I think the effect of appointing Corbett to conduct his review meant that ultimately it would be the Chief Secretary would be looking at the various funding requirements, whether risk was being transferred from ICL to the public sector, or whether risk was going to remain with the contractor. So I think that's true. But we would consult the POCL board, obviously, but the ultimate decision would be taken by government.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. How would the POCL board be consulted?
I think our officials would be engaged in dialogue, correspondence with them, talking to them.
And consulted in the sense that their views might be taken into account, but ultimately the decision rested with government?
That would be the case, yeah.
And why was that the case, given that POCL was an independent company limited by guarantee?
Two principal reasons, I think. First, that we wouldn't want, under a PFI contract, for risk to be transferred back to the public sector. It had to remain with the contractor. That's the whole point of PFI contracts. And secondly, in the end, there would be a call on the public purse, and therefore it would be right that government took responsibility for that, and we'd have to sign off on it.
And then over the page, please. At the foot of the page under acceptance. Following detailed discussions, progress has been made on acceptance. The parties have agreed that acceptance will be completed prior to the start of national rollout and is not linked to NR2+. What did you understand acceptance to be or to mean?
I can't remember now.
And so would it follow that if I ask you what the significance of an agreement that acceptance would be completed before national rollout, you wouldn't be able to assist?
What I can recall is that we would not have. We wanted to make sure, and this was through the live trials, that the system worked in practice. Now, whether that's relevant to this particular paragraph, I'm not sure. I can't recall.
I understand. Can we move forwards then, please? Because there's a follow-up letter, 9 9 days later, HMT 701, please. Am I getting a shake of the head? HMT, I count my zeros again. Yep, 701. Good. Can we just read through this? So this is a follow-up letter. This is the 18th of December now, 9 days later. Since my letter to, I should have said this is from Keith Todd again to you. There have been a number of meetings as a result of which ICL has clarified and refined its proposals set out in that letter. So it turned out that the statement that this is our last and best offer was superseded. Accordingly, since I believe a decision by ministers on that proposal is imminent, felt it would be useful to write to you today to summarise the current state of our proposal. First, POCL requested clarification of the nature and extent of Fujitsu's support for ICL. We've confirmed this will be delivered by way of a legally enforceable performance guarantee from Fujitsu in favour of the sponsors, covering all of ICL's obligations in relation to the project, including the provision of all necessary funding. Second, we've held further discussions to clarify the issues surrounding our proposals on acceptance. We've reached complete agreement on all issues relating to acceptance with POCL. This agreement is embodied in a detailed paper, a copy of which is with your officials. Paper has been discussed with BA but not agreed with them. To what extent at this stage did you understand that ICL was negotiating with the two separate elements, POCL and BA, separately from government?
Yes, I mean, I think we were expecting that because the contract was between those three parties.
And so would you, or your officials, have a way of checking back whether what is said in these letters to you was accurate?
Yes, I would have thought so.
That would be done at official level, would it? Yeah. By going back to POCL and BA?
Yeah. Yes.
Third, we've held discussions excuse me, with POCL to clarify issues relating to our commercial proposals. Again, we reached agreement with POCL on the fundamental principles which will allow us to develop a definitive, detailed, legally binding agreement with them in due course. Agreement has imposed increased volume on ICL. Fourth, although we haven't had any direct discussions with BA, I think it's helpful to state ICL's position. Proposal of 9th of December included an increase of £8 million over the Corbett proposal. In the interest of reaching a speedy conclusion, I've reluctantly agreed to renounce this increase. So a giveaway, essentially, by ICL of £8 million. And then over the page, please. Fifth, ICL has done some further work on the proposals to use the Horizon infrastructure for the delivery of better government. We've written a further paper, copies of which with your officials, but I attach a copy for your reference. Can we go to that, please? It's on page 3 of this document.
Mr. Beer, before we move on from this letter, I think there was an important element linked to the £8 million concession.
Yes.
And the condition was that the Secretary of State for Social Security would then be prepared to sign off or be positive about the whole Horizon thing.
Yes, that's at the foot of page 1, yes. On to page 2.
I think that's important because Alistair Darling was very strong, and this links back to the acceptance point, I think, about the importance of live trials. If I remember correctly, I think the Department of Social Security had a contract with another contractor which had gone badly wrong, and Alistair didn't want to repeat those mistakes. So this was an attempt, I think, to try and get Alistair to withdraw some of his conditions to give it approval. And that context, I think, is important in terms of how ICL were looking at this, because they were never keen on live trials. for Horizon.
That context that you've just referred to, is that the same issue that you mentioned right at the outset when I asked you questions of the DSS being in dispute with a contractor over the provision of IT?
Whether that was the same contract, I'm not sure, but there certainly was an issue. Because I remember in some correspondence, Alistair refers specifically to a problem they've had with a particular contract, which he identifies. I think it may be in the bundle of documents somewhere.
We'll chase that down. You can't remember whether that was ICL or not?
No, I can't recall.
Okay. Can we look at the attached paper? Thank you. So this is the paper that Mr. Todd was providing you with. And can we look at the pathway infrastructure? Pathway technology, this is what ICL say, pathway technology is based on the latest specification PCs with Microsoft NT operating system running in a highly secure, high-capacity managed network reaching the 19,000 post offices. The PCs are equipped with barcode, smart card, and magstrip card readers and receipt printers from first installation and are driven by icon-based menu systems accessed via touchscreens. All these technologies have been in successful use in 200 pilot post offices over the last year. Just stopping there. All of these technologies have been in successful use in 200 pilot post offices over the last year. Did you know whether that was accurate or not?
I was going to ask you the question, is that correct?
What was your state of knowledge at that point? That there had been...
I don't think it's accurate.
All of those technologies in successful use in 200 pilot post offices over the last year.
I'm not sure that's a fair reflection of the reality.
To what extent would a statement like this from ICL to you and to government have influenced it?
Not very much.
They continue, the application software is the world leader for new generation counter automation and is web enabled, allowing straightforward addition of further intranet services. The central hub systems provide data routing, information management, client gateways and security management, including card management services. Military levels of security, including Postmaster smart card logon and data encryption, lead to high levels of confidentiality and trust. Touch screens, icons and user-driven menus generate ease of use and staff and customer confidence. Now, to what extent would this kind of narrative influence you, or would you write it off as sort of advertising puff?
That's exactly the words I was going to use, Mr. B. It's straight out of the PR department for the company, I would have thought.
But what if you thought it was advertising puff? Would you take from it that it is being given to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, in all seriousness, by a contractor?
I would have seen it as over-promoting what they could deliver. But I think the context was that ICL wanted to become the sort of IT provider of choice for the government in relation to... We had a sort of a government modernisation programme. I think it was called Modernising Government, actually. And companies like ICL wanted to be part of that and to play a role because obviously commercially it would be very valuable for them. And this is a sort of, it's a promotional paper to show how they can assist in what the government is trying to achieve as part of that wider agenda of modernising government.
Can we look, please, at Bayes 40417? And we can see that this is a letter to you from Alistair Darling, he having been provided with a copy of the first letter from Mr. Todd, the 9th of December one. And if we just go to the second page, please, and the second paragraph. On the specific conditions that the proposal seemed to involve, I couldn't agree to the proposed approach to acceptance testing. ICL persists in asking for acceptance on the basis of a laboratory test of the systems as opposed to a live trial, particularly important when for our customers it is the service that is the crucial end product. In fact, the approach being suggested by ICL is also almost exactly that followed under the NRS2 project when the system was fully accepted in the test environment but didn't work in the field. I'm not prepared to sign up to another NRS2 experience in any event when we're talking about a system which is affecting around 15 million people, many of whom are dependent on timely and accurate payment of their benefits of their livelihood. The political risks are huge if their system is not tested properly beforehand to make sure it works. This is a risk I'm not prepared to take. Is that the reference to the past bad experience?
Yes, that's
which
the project
you're referring.
I was trying to recall, yeah. But I don't know whether that was an ICL project, though.
No. And so what was your view, then, of the paper that had been delivered to you by Mr. Todd, the modern government paper? I mean, I haven't read to you all 6 pages
I think I'm grateful. I mean, the important point here, and this is why Alistair was absolutely right, is that we could not countenance proceeding without live trials. And the reality, if you then read across to the paragraph that you've drawn the inquiry's attention to, we did not have the examples that they gave in that paragraph at the time that publication was made.
Thank you. Can we go to paragraph 33 of your witness statement, please? Which is, I should have said, on page 13. You say, the financial consequences of any decision made as to the future of Horizon were a crucial consideration. Cancelling the project would have meant writing off hundreds of millions of pounds of public and private investment in a project which was technically viable. There was also the risk of protracted and costly litigation with ICL if the project was cancelled. Now, we know now, through, amongst other things, the decision of the High Court and the Court of Appeal in this case, that the system that was eventually rolled out was not remotely robust. And a number of sub-postmasters have given evidence to the inquiry in February to May of this year to the effect that the Horizon system produced multiple unexplained shortfalls which they were unable effectively to check or to dispute. They've said that they received inadequate training and assistance provided by the Horizon helpline. Looking at the matter now, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think that the financial consequences of terminating the project were prioritised over the need to ensure that if the project did survive, it would be properly suited to the needs of the sub-postmasters who were required to operate it on the ground?
I think there are two things I'd like to say to address that. Firstly, that the possibility of cancelling the project was certainly a live consideration that I had when I was Chief Secretary. And I looked at it in some detail and concluded that actually cancellation would not be the right way forward. And I probably felt that even more strongly when I became Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, given the responsibilities I had there. In proceeding with ICL, and we had no indication as ministers of the sort of operational difficulties that you've referred to, Mr. Beer. They were never drawn to our attention. What I think we did do, which was right in the circumstances, bearing in mind that we were breaking new ground, and it was a very ambitious project. It was ambitious for the post office network, and I think that was right in the circumstances. When we got the settlement, I think it was in May 99 in the end.
Yes, it is.
When we tried to sort of reconfigure the whole thing, you know, we dropped the benefits payment card. We got one client, as it were, which was Pockle. We moved away from a PFI to a more standard traditional design and build project. So we're trying to remedy some of the faults in the contract we inherited from the previous administration. But because we were breaking new ground, we wanted to make sure that as the live trials were continuing, that we would be alerted to problems that may occur, which is why we set up, under the chairmanship of Ian McCartney, the Horizon Working Group, consisting of all the relevant parties, including the sub-postmasters, so that we as ministers could be alerted if there were problems with the rollout, and then we could act accordingly.
The inquiry's heard evidence that because of the nature of the PFI agreement, which was in operation and effective up until May 1999, Post Office Counters Limited had very limited visibility from Pathway on the technical details of the high or low level design of the Horizon system. It's been suggested that Pathway insisted that so long as they delivered the outcomes that were required by the specification, it was not a concern of the Post Office as to how those outcomes were delivered. When the contract was renegotiated in May 1999, do you remember that issue being brought to government's attention?
I don't think it was.
It's been suggested that a trick was missed in that in the renegotiation there was a failure to ensure that the technical information that had been denied to them was now provided to Pockle. Was that an issue that you in government were made aware of?
We were not made aware of that.
Coming then to May 1999, I realise I've moved forward at some pace. Can we look, please, at poll 302-8610? If we just look at the next page, please, at the foot of the page, you'll see that it's from you, but has been approved in your or signed in your absence, but approved by you. Back to the first page, please. There isn't a date, but in the top right, if we just scroll up a little bit. Received Sunday the 23rd of May, that's 1999. It's to Dr. Bain of the Post Office. Can you just read through it with me. You say there's been a long and detailed examination of the project. My ministerial colleagues and I consider that the right way forward is to reconfigure the project with without the benefit payment card, rather than to terminate it. The attached documents set out the core elements of such a reconfigured project. You'll be aware that Fujitsu have made clear that they're only prepared to hold the offer in these documents until midnight today, the 23rd of May, it being a Sunday. The offer would involve them taking significant provision in their accounts, which will be published on the 25th of May. If the offer is not accepted today, their provision will be larger. And they've said that in these circumstances, they'd only be prepared to reconfigure the project in this way on the basis of a considerably higher price than they currently offer. My colleagues and I believe it's desirable that the Post Office signs the deal on offer today. It offers early automation of post offices and a platform from which to carry forward POCL strategies of network banking and modern government services. In your letter of the 18th, you raised certain issues. First, the timing of the move by the Benefits Agency to compulsory ACT. This offers substantial efficiency savings to the Benefits Agency. The impact of delay is very costly. Despite this, I've agreed with my colleagues that if the Post Office were to sign the deal on offer today, the move wouldn't start until 2003, and it's difficult to read. There would be no change in the present arrangements under which the benefit payments can freely, benefit recipients can freely choose the payments method which best suits their needs, unless a change is the prior agreement of the Post Office. Second, funding and income. The cost of the reconfigure project is expected to have a significant impact on the finances of POCL in the next few years. In recognition of this, the government would be willing to agree that £480 million of the cash investments, including gilts, held by the Post Office, should be transferred to POCL on the signing of the codified agreement in July. POCL could draw down the £480 million at their discretion. This money would otherwise pass to the government, together with the rest of the £2 billion plus of these investments in 2002-03. No doubt POCL would seek to exploit automation to attract new business and income. The more successful they are in this regard, the longer the £480 million would, of course, last. Third, the use of infrastructure for government services. It's clearly the hope of ministers that the Post Office will be successful in retaining and winning business on merit. We firmly believe that competition for this business should be on the basis of a level playing field. We do not believe that it's in the interest of delivering efficient and effective services to customers that competition should be biased. The Post Office should do well in such environment in view of its unrivalled national network and the public trust it enjoys. Against this background, I hope your board will be willing to sign the enclosed letter and schedules today. This appears to have been received at 19 minutes past 4 by fax from the Treasury, re-signing the next day, a Sunday for signing on the Monday. Was this you putting POL under a degree of pressure?
Under time pressure, yes. It's a generous offer.
It's a generous
offer to POCL. I remember some very detailed conversations with the Treasury about being allowed to provide this 480 million of cover.
The 480 million pounds in gilts. What's the significance of the gilts?
That's money that allows them to borrow on. And the issue with the Treasury, if I remember correctly, was that, because I think this ran to 2003.
Yes, that's right.
Was that I think it was quite lumpy in terms of which years bits of money fell in, and we're trying to even it out over a period, make it easier financially.
But you refer in the letter to the prospect of increased costs in the event of delay. You refer to the inducement or what I'm describing as an inducement, of other work post-automation. You refer to the £480 million in gilts, as well as time pressure. What was that pressure, or just advocacy?
I think it made it should have made it an attractive proposition for the POCL board. Yeah.
I don't think you will have had the opportunity to study Lord Darling's witness statement to the inquiry. No. In it, we need to look at it. The cross-reference is WITN 0420 0100 at paragraph 63, page 22, and paragraph 101 on page 34. These suggest that the letter that you wrote to Dr. Bain wasn't fully reflective of your personal view, because you believed initially that Horizon was the wrong decision in the first place.
Yep.
Is that accurate?
I think, as I said earlier this morning, I had those four fundamental questions about how we'd ended up with this nightmare of a contract, which I didn't get answers to, and I've taken the inquiry through them. You know, why was it the benefits payment card? Why was it a PFI? We didn't have details of the tendering process.
Sorry, by now those things have fallen away.
They were still relevant, and that's why I think if Alistair Darling is commenting about my view of Horizon, it may well be reflecting those questions that I think all of us were raising, to be honest. I think Alistair was raising them as well.
Would it be fair, no criticism is intended of you here, because you were, of course, bound by the principle of collective cabinet responsibility, but now freed from that convention, would you agree that the project proceeded because of the threat of reputational harm to government in losing this cherished contract?
It proceeded because, look, there were no good options available to us. So we had to make the best of a very difficult situation, which I think is what we tried to do.
It proceeded, would you agree, because of the risk of to inward investment, in particular from Japan, and the prospect of a diplomatic incident?
At the time that this was under consideration, the key issue involving, and I know this as Secretary for Trade and Industry, was linked primarily with Nissan and Toyota, the big car manufacturers. Their concern was the fact that we were not joining the single European currency. That was their big issue. And this would be a very minor factor for their consideration. So I think too much could be made of that, actually.
It proceeded because of the level of sunk costs and the harm that would be caused to government and its reputation by the loss of those sunk costs.
That was one of the reasons. The other reason, which I think is important for the inquiry to be aware of, was it would have had a devastating impact on the post office network. You know, we had postmasters and mistresses who'd invested, as we were told, about £1 billion of their own money in getting for property and goodwill of post offices. That would have been devalued overnight had we cancelled the Horizon project. So there are a number of factors about why it proceeded.
Was one of the factors that it proceeded ever brought into account that it was a good and reliable system?
We wanted to ensure it was a system that worked, which is why that we put in place as ministers mechanisms and procedures to alert us to any problems if they arose during that rollout period.
by this time...
And insisting on live trials to make sure that we could see how it worked in practice.
Mr. Beer, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to have to adjourn for 2 or 3 minutes. I know that's very inconvenient at this moment, but will you bear with me, please?
Yes, of course. So we'll simply turn your camera off at this end, I think, and we'll remain in the room. So,
by way of explanation, the weather is extremely bad at the moment, which has set our alarm off, and I wanted to ensure that you didn't get an alarm going off in the middle of the proceedings, Mr. Beer.
Thank you very much, sir. Are you now ready to proceed?
As ready as I'll ever be, yes.
Thank you very much. And lastly, can I suggest that the project proceeded because of the wish to avoid litigation?
That would be one of the factors as well, yes.
And I'll ask again, what was the quality of the system to be delivered, its reliability and integrity, ever consciously taken into account in the decision making, as at May 1999? Yeah.
I think we wouldn't have proceeded had it been a system that wasn't going to function properly and deliver what we wanted for the post office. Now, as ministers, we wouldn't be involved in the sort of operational detail of that. What we could do as ministers was to set up structures to, as I think I may have said earlier, to alert us to any problems if they arose. So we had the Horizon Working Group, which had representatives of the sub-postmasters, the CWU union, and that was meeting, and one of its terms of reference was to report on these matters and how it was being delivered in practice. And we also had an ongoing dialogue with the Federation of Sub-Postmasters. I would meet their national council. I spoke at their annual conference in 2001.
Yes.
So there were those sort of opportunities for ministers to be alerted to problems if they arose.
And did the Federation ever raise problems on behalf of its members in the operation or integrity of the Horizon system, or did they generally paint a rosy picture to you?
They painted a rosy picture, and I think their evidence to the Select Committee for Trade and Industry, which was looking at this issue, seemed to say that.
Particularly rosy.
Very positive. And when I met their council in, I think it was March 2000, I think the inquiry's got a note of that meeting.
Yes.
There were no problems were raised with me.
No. Was that your route back into the sub-postmaster community through the Federation?
It would be, and I think and all through my constituency work. I mean, I had North Tyneside, Wallsend. We had postmasters, we had post offices, and occasionally they would raise issues with me, but this was never raised.
Can we turn forwards, please? I'm coming towards the end of my questions now to February 2001, and look, please, at CBO 702. This is a letter from you of the 9th of February to the Prime Minister's private secretary.
It wouldn't be from me, it would be from the head of my private office, I think.
Yes, your private secretary, I think.
Yeah.
What's the distinction to be drawn there?
I would write to the Prime Minister, my private secretary would write to the private secretary of the Prime Minister. So.
But this expresses your views?
It would do, yeah.
Thank you. The emboldened part tells us what the letter's about. It's probably now inevitable that the number of post office closures in this financial year will reach a record high. This note sets out the causes and what action we're taking to address the problem. I'm going to deal with this briefly. In the first paragraph, it says the main reason for the recent increase is the move to payment of benefits by ECT from April 2003. before we had in place a clear strategy to deal with the impact on the network. But then if we go over the page, please, and look at the foot of the page. From recent research conducted by the Post Office into the reasons for resignations, it's clear that most close their offices because of the personal circumstances, and less than 10% cite financial viability as the reason. Analysis of the reasons given for resignation over the last 6 months has been, and you'll see them set out there. And one of them is the Horizon computerization, 6% of resignations. Was that significant in any way?
Well, it's significant.
People are resigning because of the computer system that we have introduced.
Yes, I think if I recall correctly, it was people who probably were probably the age I am now, who didn't want to face the prospects of technology that they were unsure of. I mean, we had introduced, training sessions and helplines, but I think the whole sort of computerization was something that perhaps they didn't want to go through.
So you put it on or you thought about it through a sort of an age.
And people not wanting to embrace change, I guess, which can be sort of can be challenging and uncomfortable for people. Rather
than any issues with the system.
That's certainly how I read it at the time. Yeah.
Was it drawn to your attention at this time that a significant number of sub-postmasters were having a recurrent, serious issue with balancing on a weekly basis using the system?
That was never drawn to our attention.
Can we go forwards, please, to CBO 701? Again, I think this is from your PPS, Bernadette Kelly, to the private secretary for the Prime Minister. But again, your views essentially. And scroll down, please. So this is 6 days later. Your letter recorded the Prime Minister's concern at the continuing high rate of post office closures. This letter responds to your requests, etc. And then in the third paragraph, as my letter of the 9th of February said, net closures for the 9 months, April to December 2000, were 434. We now have the January figure, which is 47. If February and March were at the monthly average for the year, the total net closures for the full year will be 577. The final figure could exceed this, particularly if the completion of the introduction of Horizon, the new IT platform, continues to bunch up retirements and resignations, which might have otherwise taken place over a longer period. Why would the introduction of the Horizon platform bunch up retirements and resignations that would have taken place over a
well, I think
period?
I think the final part of that sentence explains that. It says those who don't want to train to use computers decide to call it a day. And that was the information I recall I was being given, that it wasn't because of accounting problems. It was actually that people were not wanting to train up to use computers.
And so does it come to this, that you in government were never told about the, even at this date, February 2001, of continuing problems with the operation on a weekly basis of the Horizon system by a significant number of sub-postmasters?
We went, and we'd actually, but the thing that sort of frustrates me here is that we had deliberately, after the May 99 New Deal, the settlement that we achieved, we set up the Horizon Working Group with the Minister of State responsible for the Post Office chairing it, with representatives of POCL, of the Benefits Agency, but also the Federation of Sub-Postmasters, the CWU. And that was the vehicle that we deliberately, and this is an unusual body to set up in government, to have all of those parties together. And we've done it deliberately so that if there were problems as we move forward, then ministers could be alerted to those problems. And I think as the minutes and records of the working group show, to my recollection, at no stage were ministers alerted to the problems that you're mentioning.
There are all of the questions that I have for you, Mr. Byers. Say for one, in your statement at the beginning and at the end, you express, you make statements of a general nature about having reflected on what has occurred and the losses and harms that have been caused. I ought to give you the opportunity to say anything that you wish to say in that regard.
Well, and I don't want to take up the time of the inquiry, but my comments right at the very end are sort of much broader, I think, about, and they're comments made in the light of what I've seen reported in the press. And what I don't understand in this whole scandal is how government ministers, given they were being alerted to the problems through adjournment debates, through constituency correspondence, parliamentary questions, how they managed to ignore all of that. And it could well be because they'd almost become captured by their department. I mean, there's a funny relationship, quite often a difficult relationship between government ministers and their civil servants. And sometimes government ministers, because they're working with those civil servants day in, day out, may reflect the views of the civil servants. What government ministers have got to do is always to challenge and question and disagree where necessary. And so the points I make at the end is whether and this may seem inadequate in the circumstances of the awful things that have happened to so many people. Ministers need to be trained to be government ministers. You know, we're members of Parliament, but then you move on to a totally different role when you're in government. And part of that, and we were fortunate because although we did it in private, there was a good chance in 1996 that we would form the next government. So we had training to what we should be doing as government ministers. And part of that was to listen to advice, yes, of course, but to be ready to challenge and disagree where that was necessary. And it may well be that a more structured approach may be of benefit. So that's why I made those sort of final comments at the end.
Thank you very much, Mr. Byers. There'll be some more questions for you.
So, good morning. If it pleases you, I'll proceed with questions on behalf of the group I represent.
Yes,
Mr. Byers, I represent a large number of ex-sub-postmasters, mistresses and managers, all of whom experienced the problems thrown at them by the Horizon system. Can I just pick up on a point that was raised earlier by Mr. Byers this morning? And, sir, for your records, it's at point 14.1 in the time recording on our system. You were asked about the question of whether you were aware that the Horizon system was generating evidence that was being used for the purposes of investigations and prosecutions. I think Mr. Byers put it as being prosecutions, but it was being used for investigations and prosecutions. And your answer to that was no. Okay? So, as a starting point, can we just analyse the position that, in a way, you've just discussed, Mr. Byers, which is about the operation of the civil service and briefings that you were given about this? So, can you help from your recollection whether you were given any briefings by the civil service as to the operation of the Horizon system and its connection with investigations and prosecutions?
My recollection is that we were provided with no advice or guidance or information relating to those matters.
Now, the system of being briefed by the civil service is often perhaps misunderstood. You as a minister are in fact very busy. Your diary is controlled entirely. Do you agree?
Not controlled. I mean, I think one of the lessons that we were learnt in our seminars ahead of coming into government was not to allow your diary to be controlled by your private office. That you take control of your diary, and you attach your own priorities to it.
Right. The busy part, though, of my question, you'll agree with. Your diary was busy.
It was it's the busiest I've ever been in my life, being a government minister, yes.
And that means that in terms of information getting to you, you are very reliant or entirely reliant upon the briefings being given to you by the civil service.
That's correct.
So this question of not being told that the Horizon system was going to be used as the basis for investigations and prosecutions, do you believe now, looking back, that the civil service should have provided you with information linking the Horizon system to investigations and prosecutions?
If they had that information available at the time, I would have thought it's something that they would have been sharing with the relevant minister.
Right. So this may, in fact, go back a step to what did the civil service learn, what were they told?
Yes.
Okay. Now, then let's look at your own set of knowledge. The Post Office, originally as the Royal Mail, is in fact, we believe, the oldest prosecution and investigation body in the world. Did you know that?
No.
When I ask when you knew that, I ask at the time of you taking responsibility for these matters.
I wouldn't have known at the time that it was a prosecuting authority. No.
And because of that, are you saying that you therefore weren't on notice that you should be asking questions about it?
I'm trying to recall what I was told at the time, which is difficult. You know, we were looking at 22 years ago. I would have expected, and this is an expectation, that there would have been political oversight of the approach to prosecutions.
By?
That we would have laid down guidance and some rules.
The guidance and some rules, who would they have come from? Who would have issued these guidance and rules? Would that have been a more junior minister?
It would have been. The detailed work would have been done by a Minister of State. Whether it would come up to a Secretary of State, I'm not altogether sure, to be honest. I think it would have been dealt with at probably a lower level.
Right. And this expectation that this would have been looked at and dealt with by perhaps a more junior minister, why do you come to that view, sitting there now, so many years later? What's compelling you to think about that as being something that should have been done?
It's the sort of issue that would have come across, that would have been dealt with at a political level, I think.
Yes, forgive me one moment.
What I'm not sure, I mean, what would be interesting for the inquiry, I think, is to find out whether there were any guidance, and you may already be aware of this, whether there was any guidance that had been provided as to the background for prosecutions.
And again, reflecting now on what you mean, do you mean guidance provided by, let's go through the parties, by the Post Office?
I mean, prosecutions were taking place before Horizon for a number of reasons. I'd always believed that the relationship with the Post Office and the network was such that there'd almost be a dialogue about how, if there's a deficiency in the accounts, how did that arise? You wouldn't immediately move to a prosecution. You'd try to find out what's gone wrong, what's happened. And I think, seems to me, and this may be sort of going into areas of the inquiry we'll get onto later, that there was almost a change of approach by the Post Office in terms of how they dealt with prosecutions. It seemed to be a first port of call, rather than something that would need to be properly looked into first. I could be wrong, but that's... And this is just based on press reports.
Right, so this is based on what I was going to ask, whether this was information you'd be provided.
No, it's since I left Parliament, since the matters that are being, you know, the people you're representing, since they've been so badly affected by what happened, I think there's been a different approach adopted in terms of prosecutions.
All right. One last matter. You've been asked a number of questions about the ministerial code, and we know this is going to be dealt with in greater detail later on. Just in your experience as a minister, I think that you've taken over from Mr. Mandelson and I think Mr. Darling, Alistair Darling. Did you find that there was a consistency in approach to handover notes? So one minister leaving, you taking over, a handover note setting out that these are the points that we've been dealing with, you may find them useful, and so on. Was there any consistency or I suppose a rule in relation to handover notes?
No, it was all done differently.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Byers, my name's Flora Page. I also represent a number of the former sub-postmasters and people who worked for the Post Office. My questions are about the Post Office board, the Post Office management. There's not very many of them. If I may start, please, with correspondence that we've looked at already, but which this section of we haven't looked at. First of all, HMT 6055. And this is when it comes up, this is the letter from you to Mr. Mandelson when he was in the post that you subsequently took from him. And if we go down, please, to page 2, paragraph 5. This paragraph reads as you in your HMT role, directing may be too strong a word, but certainly giving a pretty clear indication of what you expect from Mr. Mandelson in his role at the DTI. And you say that you look forward to him taking forward with the Post Office plans to strengthen POCL's management of the project, plans to give the management of POCL a much stronger commercial focus, exploration of possible partnerships between POCL and the private sector, a strategy for more transparent funding for POCL so we can be much more rigorous in defining what social value added is being bought, consider possibilities for further developments of the system to support social banking and broader account-like services. The Post Office would need to involve CITU and consult BA on this last point. So there's a few different points there, some of which I'll just ask you to explain a little more about. Plans to strengthen POCL's management of the project. Did that arise because there were concerns that POCL had not been managing the project?
We had concerns because we were aware of the difficult relationships between POCL and the Benefits Agency and ICL. It's one of the reasons why, the Corbett troubleshooter role was created. And then a strategy, I hope that the second and third points speak for themselves, a strategy for more transparent funding for POCL so we can be much more rigorous in defining what social value added is being bought. Does this refer to, we've seen in some of the correspondence from Mr. Darling and indeed from yourself in your role at the Treasury, this issue around a sort of a hidden subsidy through the Benefits Agency. And so what you're really referring to there is the need for, if the Post Office needs subsidy to continue to have its full network and give the social value that we all expect, then that needs to be transparent rather than hidden through a Benefits Agency cost, which is unnecessary from a Benefits Agency point of view. Is that what you're getting at? Yes, one of the, and there's no documentation to show this, but I was sort of considering a fallback situation. If we had to cancel the project, then we may need to move to a direct subsidy of the Post Office network. And if we were to do that, then I'd need to be able to convince my political colleagues that there was social value in so doing. So I think that's what I'm referring to there. Yeah. If we could then just look at the response from Mr. Mandelson again, which is HMT 6048. And if we can go down to the second paragraph, I think, it says in terms, in particular, I accept the remit set out in paragraph 5 of your letter,
My objective within the initial timescale of 1 month will be, as a minimum, to agree with the Post Office Board the actions that need to be taken on each of the items listed, to ensure that practical measures are put in place as quickly as possible to take these actions forward, to institute arrangements to monitor progress on a regular basis, and to be in a position to report back to colleagues such substantive progress as may have proved possible on each by the end of the first month. Do you have any recollection of that being put into effect, either by Mr. Mandelson or indeed by you, when you then took over his role?
I have no recollection of any action being taken on these issues ahead of my taking over at the end of December. Some of it would be subsumed in the work, because these letters, I think, are to do with setting up the Corbett troubleshooting role. So I think some of it almost got sort of subsumed into that work. But I don't recall anything further coming from Peter on that.
And indeed, then something which you took up, any of these points around stronger management of the project?
I certainly think through our civil service we had POCL on notice that they had to up their game. Thank you.
That document can be taken down. What I'd like to do, just as a last issue to deal with then, is wind that whole thing much further forward. Are we able to take from that that you took the view, and perhaps others in government did as well, that post office management was in need of some refreshment, shall we say?
You've been very diplomatic. The post office at the time, and it may still be the case, faced huge challenges. I mean, it was a world that was moving and developing dramatically with new technology, and I think we had reservations about the ability of the board to deliver.
Yes. Well then, as I say, going further forward, if I could ask for NFSP 6058 called up. This is a document from the 19th of March of 2001, and I suspect that this is what you've alluded to already when you say that you spoke at NFSP meetings. Mm. And of course, at this point, you're at the DTI, and we can see from the heading there that this is a report of a meeting between you and the National Executive Council. That's the National Executive Council of the NFSP.
This is 2000, yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, 2000. And what we see, if we go down, please, to page 3, towards the end of that page. So we see the paragraph that begins, the other thing that he intended, and I think I'm right in saying that he here is you, he intended to do shortly, was that within the Post Office Board there was not really a strong non-executive director on the board with retail experience, with responsibility for the Post Office network. What he'd always thought was that the needs of the Post Office network had not always been taken into account at board level. He did not think that the Federation and the network had received the degree of support or been treated as a priority, that the government felt that they should be as far as the Post Office Board was concerned. And then certain requirements had been laid down to the board in relation to the network, but he thought that what was needed was to have a Post Office Board director member who had specific responsibility for the network, and then it would be known that the person on the board was your advocate. They were looking to recruit a new person on the board with retail experience, as they could help to understand what the network could offer, and hopefully some progress would be made on that in the next week or so. So that's you telling the NFSP that, as far as you're concerned, the Post Office Board doesn't really have a voice on there. That's putting their concerns at the heart of the business. Is that fair?
Yes, if I remember correctly, I think we did insist that they made an appointment of a non-executive board member
who had retail experience.
And your hope from that, from what we get here, is that that person would be an advocate on the board for the network and for sub-postmasters?
Because of the retail element, they'd have retail experience, yeah.
And did that reflect at that stage a concern that the board was not really listening to the network, was not really listening to sub-postmasters as they should have been?
I think that's the clear implication of what I'm saying.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
So I believe that's all the questions that any of the call participants wish to ask. So you're on mute still.
Thank you, Mr. Beer. All that remains, Mr. Byers, is for me to thank you for coming to give evidence and answering many questions about many different and varied aspects of this case. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
So,
Mr. Beer, before we actually adjourn, so that we can have a reasonable lunchtime, what's the prediction for the witness this afternoon?
only Miss Hodge knows, because she's taking Susan Graham, not me.
Right.
And I don't know that information.
All right, fine. Well, we'll assume that taking an hour is all right. Shall we do that?
Yeah, if we apply the presumption of rectitude that we need to finish at 4:15.
Right.
Let's say 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. 2 o'clock it is. Thanks very much.